Thank you. And thanks to everybody for being here today. This is a great opportunity to get to meet you. I wish I could be there in person, but this actually might work out better so we can save the recording. So, like we said, I'm Lee Daly from CARD. CARD is an organization that provides free training, guidance, and support to people on the autism spectrum across their lifespan, and as well as the communities in which they live to better understand them. So today what we're going to be doing is working on gaining a basic understanding of autism and how these different features of autism will play into safeguarding the public anywhere, basically, is what we want to be thinking about, not just at the shore. We're going to also talk about some strategies to improve the ability to communicate during a stressful experience and ways to encourage cooperation when you're doing your job. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about what is autism. And so it is a neurobiological disorder that affects the way that the brain and the body work together. It can affect people in a variety of different ways. So from one person to the next, you're going to see quite a bit of difference in the way that their characteristics are presenting. Currently, there is no known cause for autism. There's a theory that it has to do with biological factors and also possibly environmental factors. There's no evidence that it's caused by immunizations or parental behaviors. It is something that is diagnosed across all racial, ethnic, and social backgrounds everywhere in the world. Autism can occur by itself, but it can also occur alongside other disabilities or other health problems. So intellectual disabilities, epilepsy, changes in growth rate metabolism, mental health issues, they can all co-occur with autism. The current CDC estimate is that 1 in 54 individuals in the USA are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Interestingly, the ratio for boys to girls is about 4 to 1. So every one girl that gets diagnosed with autism, there are 4 boys diagnosed with it. That's starting to change. We're finding that some of the ways that we are assessing for autism are actually gender biased. And so a lot of girls are kind of getting passed over in terms of getting the diagnosis early. But we're seeing some changes now in that. And the research is showing that girls present a little bit differently than boys do. It's usually diagnosed in childhood, but sometimes with older individuals who are in their 50s or 60s. Back in the day, autism wasn't really a thing that people were looking for. So it was often diagnosed as things like schizophrenia or paranoia or other types of disorders that weren't really accurate. And then later on in life, they get diagnosed with autism, and it makes so much more sense to them. Early identification is important. That's why we talk about it in children a lot. The reason why it's important is because people can really get some therapies early on and help improve their later outcomes. You also might notice that when you see depictions of people on the autism spectrum, that they're typically white and male. However, that does not mean that there are not as many Hispanic or Black children on the autism spectrum, but there is some discrepancy in terms of how much they get that diagnosis. So it's less likely for a Black or Hispanic child to get diagnosed due to a lot of different factors. Some of them are avoidance of stigma of getting a diagnosis, and some of them have to do with the fact that there's a language barrier sometimes for Hispanic children to get that treatment and diagnosis. So some of the characteristics that we talk about when we talk about autism, we have social impediments, which means that the ability to understand the reciprocity going back and forth between people can be somewhat challenging for people on the spectrum. So being able to make that eye contact, to face the person they're talking to wait and take turns back and forth, sharing information, communicating on the same topic. sticking to the social norms and the rules of, what we typically do in communication is sometimes not inherently understood by people on the spectrum. So it can be challenging and something that they might even have to get some instruction on or have some therapies in order to do that. There are also sometimes just actual physical issues with creating speech. So they may have thoughts, but not be able to actually verbalize those thoughts. It also can affect the way that they take in information from others. So being able to read the subtleties of somebody's communication, whether they're being sarcastic or whether they are trying to fool them or trying to trick them. It can be hard to tell because they're not necessarily reading those cues. We also note that some people have intense focus on certain topics. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the coming slides, but that can be a really interesting thing because they may become experts in that topic, but it also can sometimes interfere with other learning it because they kind of just hone in on that one thing that they're really into and don't really want to engage in much other learning. It is a way to get into their happy place. So if you're trying to communicate with somebody on the autism spectrum and you know that they might have a special interest, say like maybe it's on their t-shirt or they might even be holding an item that is related to their special interest, you can try to make some communication with them and some inroads to cooperation by utilizing their special interest, especially during a time of stress. Many people with autism have sensory issues, either too much or too little sensation, and this can sometimes create a sense of overload. It can also be problematic if a person doesn't have enough sensation coming in, because sometimes what they'll do is they will seek out sensory experiences in order to sense they're being grounded or feel like they're in the space. But it can actually become problematic when it comes to being near other people because they may want to touch other people's hair or textures that they see. They may want to taste or smell or, kind of do things that are socially kind of awkward in terms of approaching a person and being near another person. Other times they may be avoidant of those sensory things, and it just depends on the individual and what their particular system is made like. We see a lot of need or desire for routines and repetition. So that's a comfort for people on the spectrum. Making a lot of transitions without having prior warning is really difficult. And of course, the world is like that. The world is very random and doesn't often give us a forewarning about what's going to happen next. So it can be difficult being on the spectrum and kind of just going with the flow of things. And that's why sometimes we will see behaviors occur. So the more that we can create a sense of predictability about our actions and about our interactions with them, the better it will be for them to be able to manage the situation so their anxieties don't go skyrocketing through the roof. So we all know that we have these 5 senses, right? The touch, taste, smell, auditory, and visual. But we also have balance. And balance is one of those things that can be affected by autism. Our awareness of our body and space is another sense. And sometimes people with autism will also have difficulty of being able to gauge how close or far away they are from something dangerous. They may be right on the edge of a precipice and not be aware that that drop is several, feet down or maybe 100 feet down. It may look a lot closer to them. So sometimes that can be, a thing to consider, that their sensory processing might be off balance or out of sync with reality. The other part is interoception. That's the sense that we all have of what the signals are from inside of our body. So hunger, knowing what hunger feels like, knowing what a pain from a headache is as compared to a pain from a stomach ache or nausea. Being able to identify where the pain is coming from and express it to somebody else is often something that's hard to do. And again, we might see increased behavioral issues around something like an undiagnosed injury or an undiagnosed medical condition that, could be really troubling the person, but they're having a difficult time even ascertaining that that's the problem, and then having the communication issue about getting it across to somebody else. So these are some areas of sensory processing to be considering when you're interacting with people on the spectrum. Stimming is something that people often will do. This is a little sort of a montage of different things that some people might do. They may walk in a certain way or jump up and down, tiptoe walk. Sometimes we see little kids doing that, walking on their tiptoes. Often we might see hand wringing, hand flapping, finger movements, or it might even be verbalization, that they may say or repeat the same sounds over and over. This is just part of that repetitive, restricted behavior that's part of that diagnosis. The reasons for stimming actually are now considered to be self-regulatory, meaning that it provides that person some sense of comfort to do that. However, sometimes stimming can be a little bit, it can look dangerous sometimes. It might be head smacking, it might be head hitting against a wall, especially if there's some type of internal pain that they're feeling. If that's the case and they're doing something that isn't particularly safe to do, sometimes we try to redirect that behavior. We're on to common healthcare issues. So these are just some general things that tend to be problematic in people with autism, is that they tend to have problems with their gut and have digestion issues, issues with allergies and food allergies or food intolerances. So a lot of times having special diets might be something that families do in order to help reduce some of that discomfort. About 33% of people with autism have seizures. So that is something to be thinking about too if you're encountering somebody on the spectrum. Sleep is a big problem. A lot of times they cannot stay asleep through the night. They may have that sensory sensitivity to sounds or light, and so just the slightest, thing that will wake them up in the middle of the night. And some have a real difficulty actually winding down at the end of the day, and so they may be up until the mid hours of the morning alone doing stuff in the home, and parents might be asleep, or partners might be asleep, and the person could be up and doing stuff all night. So it puts a strain on that individual's mental health and physical health, but it also puts a bit of a strain sometimes on the family because of safety concerns about being, maybe wandering or doing something during the night. Anxiety is in about 77% of people on the autism spectrum. Anxiety is listed as the #1 co-occurring mental health problem. You'd imagine if you can't communicate very well, effectively, and you feel like the sensory issues are overwhelming and you don't necessarily feel that connected to other people, it can be very anxiety provoking to be in the world like that. So these are some things to be thinking about, because when we're anxious, we definitely behave in a different way. And if there's an emergency happening, our anxiety is going to be heightened. So it tends to impact the person's ability to function rationally and communicate effectively. So here are some things that we're going to think about, especially in terms of what safety concerns you might find in the settings that you're going to encounter people in. So elopement or wandering is one of the biggest concerns for people on the autism spectrum. It just means that they may leave without notice. They may leave the caregiver without notice. They may leave the setting without notice, the school, the hospital. It's very common for people to not tell others where they're going when they're wandering, because they don't perceive it as elopement. They perceive it as, I want to go see this thing. I'm interested in seeing the pond outside, or I want to go explore where the railroad tracks are. I saw it on the way in the car, and now I'm going to go and look for it. So these are situations that often wind up in tragedy because people tend to get into situations that can actually be dangerous, like drowning. Drowning is the #1 cause of accidental death in this population, possibly because water is such a sensory draw. It's got so many sensory aspects to it, and it is nice and quiet when you go under the water. Unfortunately, sometimes people will go directly into the water with all their clothes on and then not be able to get out because they're weighted down. Some people on the spectrum like to explore the world through their mouth. They taste things, they put things in their mouth to feel what they feel like and get that texture, but they may not be aware that what they're putting in their mouth is really toxic or very dangerous. Sense of danger for some is kind of not really built in, and so they don't get afraid when there's dangerous dogs barking at them, or if people look threatening or are holding a weapon. They don't necessarily perceive it as a danger. They also may be fascinated by certain dangerous things like fire and flame or weapons. They may have a special interest in a particular kind of weapon and know all about guns or know all about explosives. Having access to things like that can also trigger some pretty scary situations. Hyposensitivity and hypersensitivity are two things. Hypersensitivity obviously is just getting overwhelmed by your senses, but hyposensitivity is a problem too, because if you don't feel a certain amount of pain, you're going to possibly get exposed to damaging experience like burns, or you could be walking around with broken bones in your body and not be sensing the pain from it until you actually, have some serious nerve damage or serious blood loss or something like that. So that could be a problem. There's also the danger of unfamiliar adults, and this is particularly true for people who typically don't use their voice to speak. So if an unfamiliar adult is abusing them, they will not be able to explain what's happened. They will have very little ability to express who, what, when, where kind of answers. And so that can be a big danger. Abduction can be a big danger too, because a lot of people don't read the differences between safe people and unsafe people, or I know this person and I don't know this person, so I'm going to go with the person I know, not with the person I don't know. There's really no stranger danger in certain people. And quite often in young children, they may not respond to their name, which is a particular problem if they're out eloped out somewhere and the rescue team is looking for them, calling their name. They may hear it, but they may not respond. And so that can be problematic as well. So during emergencies, sometimes it can be helpful to have some tools. Obviously, like having strategies is good, but there actually are physical tools that might help to reduce some of the overwhelming sensations and to kind of distract from uncomfortable feelings. So we might see people using weighted blankets or weighted vests to kind of create a sense of comfort in their body and vestibular system, that proprioceptive feedback about the body and space. Sometimes it feels better to have a little bit of weight kind of bearing on you to feel like you're getting grounded. Some people like to use electronics. A lot of people on the spectrum use electronics for a lot of different things, but sometimes they use it for communication as well, because they may not have an effective way to communicate verbally. You might use something to cut off sound, like maybe these headphones could actually have no music whatsoever playing, but just kind of muffling the sounds around the person. That can create a sense of comfort as well. And fidget toys, chew toys. This is called jewelry. This actually is, this blue thing that looks like a hammer is actually about the size of a thumb. and it might be worn around the neck on a lanyard. That way, if the person likes to chew on things that aren't really particularly healthy to chew on, this is a way to have that chewing kind of behavior without making it damaging to the person's health. So in communication, one of the things we want to think about is that usually people with autism will have receptive skills where they can hear and understand some, but they may have expressive deficits. They may not be able to express much in terms of language, or what they express may be specifically about certain things. They may have difficulty with the who, what, when, where, why, and how questions, but they can tell you all about their special interest area. Or they may even script a whole scene from a movie or a show that they've watched to explain how they're experiencing something. And it's kind of maybe matches up sometimes, and sometimes it may not match up, and you may be questioning what are they talking about. So you might have to probe a little bit sometimes if they're scripting and it sounds like they might be talking from another thing that they saw either on TV or in the movies. Some people will use devices to communicate. So it would be like an iPhone or a tablet or something, and they would have a way to touch it and make sentences basically using pictures, and that might speak for them. You can imagine that if you don't have that and that's what you use to communicate, it could be really frightening and scary to not have the ability to make your thoughts known. When we communicate, it's important to think in literal terms, if possible. So what you're saying is what you're meaning, and trying to avoid things like, well, it's raining cats and dogs. You know, that's an idiom, or that's a saying that a lot of people know what that means. But sometimes people who think literally are actually getting a picture in their head of what that looks like, and it has nothing to do with the fact that it's raining hard. They're just confused why cats and dogs are falling. Processing time is usually longer in terms of understanding the information and being able to formulate responses back to you. So sometimes when you ask a question, you may see a sort of blank look. That might mean that they're trying to process what you're saying. So wait a little bit longer than you think before you re-ask the question, because sometimes it does take a little while for them to actually respond. Confusion over double meanings of words can also lead to miscommunications. So just know that if they look confused, it might be because the words we're using are used in a different way than what they're used to. So the reason I say use positive language rather than negative is because there's a high tendency for people to kind of try to get a picture in their head of what we're saying, like a literal picture or a movie. And if we say we don't want them to do something, it doesn't translate well into the picture. It actually kind of creates the picture of what we don't want them to do. So let's take a little look at this, like in terms of positive versus negative. Hold my hand would be positive. Negative would be stop pulling away. So if you're a visual thinker, if I say stop pulling away, I get a picture of pulling away. Think about a way that you could say don't resist and don't fight me in a positive way instead of the negative way. Can anybody think of what you would say in order to get cooperation?
Not green.
It's still?
No, what's it say?
Yes, it's still. That's very simple, right? It says exactly what you want them to do. Same thing with stop running, right? Getting the image of running, we don't want that. We don't want them to get that image because that just puts that idea further out there, so we don't want that. Stay by me. So, because people with autism have a highly developed sense of visual imagery, if they are sighted, if they have a visual impairment, obviously it's going to be different, but most will tend to be visual learners. And so having a visual support around is helpful. Now, Bonnie has some visual supports to show you, just to kind of see what I mean by that. If the person is able to read, sometimes they can just read the words. So it's fine to have visual words to show them. The good thing about visual supports is that when you're done talking, the visual stays there. So if they're listening and they kind of caught some of it, but their processing was slower, they have a visual to reference to now. That's one thing that can be really useful. And we can help make visual supports for your situation. So this is an example, is a prompt card for communication. So on one side, it has the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it has some questions that you might be asking of a person that you've encountered, maybe on an emergency call. You might be able to prompt them to lay down or to wait. You might want to ask, are you hurt? Where? Show me, and that way they can kind of point and gesture if they can't use their voice. For on the back of the card, you have the keyboard. If they're used to using a keyboard, that might be useful, a way to communicate, to spell their name, or if they have a question they want to ask. There's a pain scale, or a scale from 1 to 10. It doesn't necessarily have to do with pain. It could be anything really that you can quantify on a scale of 1 to 10. And then it's a way for them to communicate. They have a yes and no. They have, I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. So it gives them an ability to express themselves in some way. Now it's limited, of course, because it's a card. It's low tech. But at least it's something, and sometimes that can make the difference between, having a traumatic experience and having an okay experience. One thing that we also recommend, if you have the ability and you're in a situation where you can cut down on some of the noise in the situation, maybe you're responding to an accident, or you're responding to a house fire, and there's a place that's safe enough to be, but it's slightly away from all the frenetic energy. If there's a place for that person or that, family member to go and be calm under supervision, that would be helpful. Also, explaining that if they have to go into an EMS vehicle, or if they have to go to the hospital, explaining that this is going to be different and it's temporary. You're not moving in to the hospital. This is not the final destination. Because sometimes without that warning, people will assume that they're just going to have to leave their home and this is going to be where they live from now on. So explain that, sometimes during an emergency, we have to do things that are different than what we're used to. And so this is just temporary. We have something called a distract pack, and that is a helpful little toolkit that has some fidget toys, sensory items, some things that might cut down on sensory overload, and a way to kind of self-distract. So that is useful to have something like that on you if there's a vehicle that you travel in, having a bag or something like that that has some comfort items in them. We can show you a picture of what they look like. We also think that with that need for predictability and sameness, sometimes people will feel really kind of triggered and upset if there's a lot of transitions and rushing. But sometimes that's the urgency of the situation, and you do have to rush, and you do have to make some quick comments and decisions for the group of people you're working with. Just know that that's probably going to cause some difficulties for people on the spectrum, because they're just not adept at being able to go with that quick pace flow. So you may see some challenging behaviors around that. One thing that we do at CARD is we develop stories. They're called social stories or social experience stories that help prepare a person for a situation. It's kind of hard to prepare for an emergency, but there are certain things that we can do, like teaching kids to have fire drills at home, or evacuation drills at home. We recommend this to families, but I know that sometimes you're also doing some education about fire safety and about emergencies. So this is an opportunity to develop a story about your particular job and what you do. So here's sort of a social experience story about fire drills that they're kind of made for children usually, but it just tells what to expect in the situation and what kind of behaviors would be helpful to go through that situation and cooperate. So that kind of prompting and priming experience helps to reduce the anxiety when the actual situation comes about. And that's why we create those, to kind of reduce the anxiety and give people a sense of what to do. This is an example of our distract pack. It's just a bag with some sensory items in it, maybe some headphones to cut down on the noise, and fidgets and things like that. Usually things that we can clean, so we try to keep it so that it could be sanitized afterward in case we want to reuse it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about behavior. Sometimes people, when they have a difficulty using their voice to communicate, they only have their behaviors to communicate now. So that's what we see sometimes is a lot of sort of challenging behaviors. There might be that stimming, that compulsive movement and repetition behavior. There could be self-injuring behavior like scratching or slapping. Sometimes there can actually be a tantrum, and that would be typical for any child really, whether they're on the spectrum or not. Tantrums are just a natural part of behavior before we learn how to cope and wait for things or express ourselves in more effective ways. There is a difference, however, between a tantrum and a meltdown. A meltdown is a response to being overwhelmed and having reached the limit of what you can handle. And so sometimes people on the autism spectrum will have this sort of meltdown where they really just lose touch with rational thought. And we like to think of that almost like a seizure, because if a person was having a seizure, you wouldn't be angry with them, right? You wouldn't take it personally that they're having this response. It would be, you would do what you would do in that situation to protect them and help to make them safe and comfortable until that seizure ended. So think about that in terms of meltdowns too, because sometimes they really are not in control of just stopping it and turning it off. It has to sometimes run its course. Sometimes it's helpful to provide them with a choice about what they can do when they're upset, and that can sometimes help to redirect some of their behaviors. So redirection is one thing that we would recommend, but you can also, if there's a way to take a break, if their treatment is requiring a lot of physical activity, they may need to take a break from it, even if it means delaying some of their care. They just may do better if you just give them some break time. We also use something called a first and then visual aid. So with this, if they have to do something that's very difficult for them, like put on that blood pressure cuff and let you test the blood pressure and get tight and squeeze their arm, offering them something after they complete that task, like a fidget toy or something rewarding that would be, desirable by that person, they're much more likely to do it and go through it, even though it's uncomfortable for them. So we use this visual sometimes. Parents really rely on it a lot. Parents will use these a lot, but sometimes it might be useful to have something like that. So in those difficult situations, if a person has a history of aggressive behavior, try to learn from the family or the caregiver or loved one, if they're an adult, what helps them calm down, especially in the situation like a meltdown. What helps them to feel better? Crowding and kind of overwhelming the person and doing physical contact or physical touch sometimes will actually escalate the situation. So we want to avoid using physical touch or restraints whenever possible. Avoid that. and only use it, in the case of a safety issue where they might damage themselves in some way. If they are having a meltdown or some type of acting out behavior, it's best to try to remove any audience that could form or keep people away so that whatever physical behaviors they do, it doesn't hurt anybody else. If there's a caregiver or a loved one nearby and they're used to handling it and they might actually be able to de-escalate it, utilize them, ask them to get involved. Sometimes it may mean just getting into the emergency vehicle with that person just to kind of keep them close to somebody who's familiar and help them get through that situation while they get transported. If there's a way to escort them to a quieter place or find a quieter place, maybe you can do that. Offer them something to distract themselves. And also try to kind of think about your stance and your own tone and trying to keep that calm, because that sense of mirroring can happen if you're calm. I wanted to see what you would think about in this situation. Let's say you're responding to a call for a motor vehicle accident and it's on a busy street, and when you arrive, the driver is injured and unconscious, and there's an adolescent in the back seat who's not making eye contact or responding to your questions. He's clutching a cell phone. What are some strategies for communication? What would you do to try to help him communicate with you?
Maybe offer him a small would something trust.
Exactly. Yes. You're going there as a helper. Sometimes they don't know that, right? So you may offer them something of interest, an item or something. What about the phone? Could the phone be used in some way?
We could ask him what game he's playing or what he's doing on his phone.
Yeah.
See if it's something we could talk about and expand upon and maybe distract the situation.
Sometimes people will actually be able to text and communicate with you, so they may be able to show emojis, by pointing at certain things. So they also might have their name, on that phone. So then you'd learn, okay, I see your phone. Oh, your name is Dylan. Okay. And then you might actually start thinking about, all right, well, how do we find out about the rest of the family here? We do actually at CARD have a first responder tool thing here. It's called My Health Passport. It is an item that actually has a communication card inside of it, and it can be put around a seat belt or a safety belt so that if a first responder were to come upon the car, they would see this sort of red cross, and inside of it, it has all the information about that individual. So it might have their blood type, it might have any medical conditions that they have. It even has a little chart inside to show what's wrong. So there might be like nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, or some pain, point to the body where your pain is. So that could be useful too. And we give these out free to families who are interested in having them in the car so that somebody could communicate in case the parent's disabled or somebody's, not able to communicate for that individual. This does a little bit of communication. So on that situation, what would you do about safety concerns? What are some of the safety concerns that you would be wondering about for this individual in the back seat?
That they possibly have injuries that they're not telling you about or that they don't know they have.
Exactly. So you would have to be prompting them specifically or asking, can I check you? You would definitely want to let them know before you put hands on them what you're going to do. Like, I'm going to reach and touch your arm, or I'm going to check your throat, I'm going to look in your eye. Just to let them know ahead of time what you're going to do. That way it's not a surprise and they're getting prepared mentally for that kind of sensory input.
Hey, what about using the cards the materials that we handed out?
You could use the "is something wrong," right? You could use that one, or you could use the communication card. That's an option too, if they have the ability to point their finger. Individuals who are a little bit more profoundly affected by autism, they may not even recognize that using a finger to point at a picture actually communicates anything. So this is something that you might find that the individual is very challenged in that way. They can't really communicate. But there are several that will and do learn how to communicate just by pointing at things. And some are very verbal. Some are extremely verbal, and they communicate effectively very well. It just depends, and that's a spectrum. The spectrum is really, really wide. And some people are very intellectually gifted, and other people might have intellectual disabilities. It just varies. What would you do if you had this scene here and you were noticing that they're covering their ears and they're rocking? What do you think is going on for that person in that situation?
It's too loud for them.
Is there anything that can be done in order to reduce some of the sensory overload?
Headphones.
Headphones.
Yeah, if the sirens don't need to be on, or if the lights don't need to be flashing, or if your radio, maybe, you could turn that down. If you have your walkie-talkie on, or you're using some other method, you could turn it down. Just cut down on some of that excess of noise, sight, sound, or touch.
I have a son that's on the spectrum.
Yeah. A son on the spectrum, okay. What we talked about today, does that make sense in terms of your experience of your son on the spectrum? Are there other safety things that you would want to share?
Kind of like you said, the spectrum's so wide. There's so many different varieties, and specifically my son, he has no regard for safety, kind of like as you mentioned. But when it comes to relaying his feelings and thoughts, he typically knows what he wants or needs, but it's hard for him to relay that. With him, we have to speak very short, and you have to keep his attention. One of the things that we do is we tell him to look at our eyes. We say, "Landon, can you see my eyes? What color are my eyes?" And it gets him to focus on you. And at that point, you have his attention. Then you can communicate. You have a short window, but then you can communicate.
Absolutely. And you also mentioned that you use his name. A lot of times, if you're using their name at the beginning of the sentence, it clues them in that you're talking to them, because that attention is a big issue sometimes. And knowing if they're being talked to or you're talking to somebody else if they're not looking directly at your face, they don't necessarily know that you're even talking to them. Some of the challenges that you're going to face may just be being able to communicate effectively with them. So the idea is to try to use visuals, try to reduce their anxiety as much as possible, and limit how much sensory stuff that they have to deal with. Those are the basics. And keep them safe as much as possible. So their wandering away can happen in the midst of, while you're doing a rescue procedure. And that wouldn't be unlikely because there's so much going on. They may just wander away to find some peace and quiet.
In contrast to some of the other groups that we've gone to in the county, I would think that because there's such a high stress level with interaction you guys have been having, you might encounter more of these situations. Would you say that's truly?
Well, yes. There are a lot of safety concerns. So you're definitely going to see heightened anxiety, heightened responses to things that happen in emergency situations. And they may not comply with direct requests or demands, which sometimes with law enforcement can end in tragedy. If they don't want to put down the thing that they're holding and the police don't know that that's a non-violent weapon, it could just be an object that they're holding, but if they won't put it down, that sends off alarms, for people. So sometimes that can result in a really big problem. But it's usually because of anxiety. They're clutching onto something because of anxiety, and they're just trying to manage themselves in that situation, and they're doing the best they can. The number one kind of situation that you might find yourself responding to is a drowning or a missing person elopement situation. So you may be working with law enforcement on some of these issues. We don't get too much hypothermia here, but we might get hyperthermia because they're that interoception thing again. They may not know that they're dehydrated, or they may not know that they're overheated. Heat stroke and things like that can happen.
Oh, I had a quick question. How often would you have to have something that might be identifying the fact that they're on the spectrum that they would see, or would it be mostly that they would have to look for cues? Depending on their age, sometimes if they're of adult age, sometimes they may have a card like a license. It's like a D that they put on the license that just indicates that the person has a disability, but it's not specific. Some people actually have an arm, like an armband with the autism symbol on it, or some type of thing like that, but it's not very typical for people to have identification or any kind of indication. Especially sometimes parents, they don't necessarily want to have that broadcast because it could put their child at risk. If a predator is looking for somebody who may not be able to identify them, they're a prime target. So other times parents also might decide that because their child gets treated differently, they don't want to necessarily put them at a disadvantage, so they may not mention it until it needs to be mentioned. And that sometimes happens in the hospital too. Like if people are getting into the hospital and no one tells the staff that the person is on the autism spectrum, they have all kinds of expectations about how the person's going to behave and how they're going to respond. And when they don't do it, it's not necessarily the first thought that comes to mind that they may have a processing disorder. They may just think that the person is drunk or on drugs or being non-compliant. So that's why it's important, for trying to get that information from anybody around the person who can explain it. If the person can self-advocate, that's even better. That's what we try to teach adults on the spectrum to do, is self-advocate and say it out front. So that just kind of eliminates some of that questioning and some of those assumptions that could be dangerous. Anybody have any questions or concerns about working with individuals on the spectrum?
Got one. You talked about stimming.
Stim.
Be self-destructive or harmful. Should they like redirect them?
Mm-hmm.
Redirect one harmful.
That's a really good question. So the question is, when a person is stimming and it's dangerous, it may be self-injurious, or it may be putting them at risk for an accident. A redirection can take the form of giving them something that provides a similar stimulation. So if they're doing something that is pressure, maybe they're smacking themselves or hitting themselves or biting. Sometimes they will bite their hands or their fingers. There might be a way to give them something that would provide that deeper pressure. So, or a fidget toy or something that, like a clothespin, a clothespin would put some pressure, but it wouldn't be damaging. So just trying to replace the stimming with something that would be either soothing or interesting to guide their attention away from what they're doing to stim. You also want to provide feedback when they do anything that looks like compliance and cooperation with you when you need it. Just give them that feedback, like, thank you for sitting calmly, or thank you for breathing deeply and using your calming strategies. Just telling them what they're doing right is sometimes also helpful to kind of reduce their sense of anxiety. Also, I've also heard people saying, sit on your hands. If their hands are doing stimming that is unsafe, sitting on their hands will actually make it harder to do. So you can give them a direction to do something that makes the stimming less possible.
Do you think bringing them into the back of the ambulance would be like a good situation and kind of calm their nerves, or be more overwhelming?
It depends. It might be calming for them. They might be fascinated by, some of the things inside there. They may want to explore it, but also they might have anxiety about being separated from their loved ones. So you could check and see, if if it feels safe to them. That would be probably a quieter place to be.
Good question. Do you, because children are so fascinated by fire trucks, generally speaking, do you find that would be something that, maybe a little tour or something like that?
Definitely, if you offer something like that, that would be great to have, families available to come and touch a truck. Some of the people's special fascinations are trucks, or specifically fire trucks. I actually have seen the opposite, where they're terrified of the trucks because they make that noise, and they go so fast, and they're, everybody acts differently on the road when they're coming. So that can also be something to overcome. You'll probably go into schools at some point and do some education, or have an opportunity to have some classes come and visit the firehouse or the station, get a little bit of a primer experience in that. That's kind of like having that social story, is having people come and make a visit, so it's not the first time they've ever come in contact with helpers. That could be useful too. It's just, having a little bit of experience with the helpers and knowing that you're there to help, you're safe people, that they should listen to your guidance and cooperate when you're there.
I was going to say two main things, just from my personal experience, for like if everyone could take away from this, is distraction and comfort. Typically when we're going to be working with people on the spectrum, it's going to be somewhat hectic of a scene or whatever. If you can keep them distracted from that and in their own world per se, usually the outcome will be a lot better. And comfort as well. Sometimes if we need to transport them, or say, they have a single mother and they're going to have to come along, bring something that they are comfortable with that reminds them of home. Whether it be a blanket, a stuffed animal. My son likes toys, so anytime we go to a new place, he likes animals. We have a whole trunk of animals, and he'll pick 2 or 3, and we'll take those with us whenever we go to a new area or place, and that's what he's focused on. So sometimes if you could bring a toy along, it could make a scene a lot better. So yeah, comfort and distraction. I would just keep that in mind.
Thank you for sharing that. That's excellent advice. Having a distract pack on your vehicle would be useful. Having something like that, even if it's just a few items that you could offer in case they can't grab something last minute.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us make a visit, and we'll be happy to help out if you ever need to get some visual supports or develop anything like a social story. We can help you with that. All right.